Hello guys, welcome back to Nodasmeca. It's Marco here, and today we continue painting clean illustrational models using brush as an airbrush. You know that I love airbrushing, but all that the airbrush can do, you can do it with a brush. And not the other way around. And I'm not talking about some crazy process with oil paints, but of simple classic acrylics. When you deeply understand the paints and tools you are using, you become able to recreate a style in infinite, really personal ways. And this video, that's a love letter to artistic exploration, continues and expands the topics of the previous one. So consider them as a single entity that you can watch in any order.
To prove my point, I used not only a similar clean illustrational approach, but also the same major colors and general scheme, with a completely different practical workflow that will make the joy of hardcore brush painters. This incredible model is from Terrible Kid Stuff, and their line of crazy little goblins of the Green Skull Castle project, that's live on Kickstarter in this precise moment. I went for the strong warm sensations of a desert theme, to push on the contrast and irony of a goblin impersonating a dwarf, and a finish full of textures, and crazy cross-hatching inspired by the comic covers of the 90s, to give the idea of the dry environment and the hard life of this little guy. The result is a totally different story, created with the same building blocks.
Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button to always know what happens on the channel. And if you want to support my work, like, comment, share, watch another video, and maybe check my Patreon page, where you can find the real-time footage of my videos, with every single little line and brushstroke. Thanks a million, guys!
I always recommend to beginners and intermediate painters to think about light and values and colors as two separate entities. They obviously work together, and in the final model they arrive to your eyes at the same time, but it's much easier to work them in separate stages, to better understand their relative weight and contribute to the different stories and sensations you want to deliver. We usually work with a balanced use of both, but there are situations where color is everything, and stories where values and volumes are all you need to explain your point. Studying these extremes is easy to understand how powerful and complex they are, even in their pure form. And that's why, most of the times, I show you a complete separation of the two things, setting first the general sketch in black and white, and then applying colors on top of it. But in this case, the story I want to tell and the image I have in mind are extremely unbalanced towards warm tones and sensations, so I feel the need to fix a foundational warmth from the very beginning, using a warmer version of the usual white primer. This is just a simple, general, flat coat of primer, and I'm using the airbrush only to speed up this step, and because I don't have a spray can of this kind of color. So don't worry, from now on you'll see only brushwork. By the way, prepare to be blown away by the next step. 2 years of YouTube channel, and more than 100 videos, and this is the first time you see me using pre-made GW washes. And this is a faithful representation of how and how often I use them in my everyday work. I add also to the palette a good amount of medium, that I'll use in every new step to ease my mixes and airflow on the model. You can use any kind of medium. In this case I'm using Josonia Magic Mix, because it has inside a bit of matte varnish, that helps obtaining a solid matte finish in every layer, but you can easily obtain the same adding a drop of varnish inside your medium. As miniature painters, when we think about zenithal lights and quick value sketches, we think about airbrush and spray cans. But these ideas were a thing way before the advent of sprayed effects, even in miniature painting. And this is a trick to obtain a similar result with a similarly quick and easy application using only the brush. I prepare my first general wash, adding a good amount of medium and a few drops of water to a little pool of Seraphim Sepia. This color has a powerful yellow note, perfect to boost from the beginning the tone of the warm light of a cartoony desert. And I apply it on the whole model in a uniform way, pushing paint inside the details, and trying to avoid pools and smudges. The idea is to start defining the largest elements and shapes with the first delicate value modulation, mostly created by the sculpt, and I don't use the original opacity and covering power of this color, because even if in a simplified way, I want to keep full control on the evolution of the sketch. And here is the result of this first application. It's all about controlling the opacity of the paint. And the second layer is still Seraphim Sepia, but a bit more concentrated, with less medium and water. And I use the mix in a more conscious and controlled way, hitting only deeper details, and the lower and the most hidden parts of each volume. I repeat this same application a couple of times, quickly fixing each fluid layer with a blow dryer. And I end up with something like this, where details are defined by different dynamic intensities and opacities, and volumes start getting a higher contrast and a more three-dimensional feel. I apply the same idea, dilution and process, to the darker tone of Agrax, reducing every time the area of application, to better define the deepest details and shadows. And this is the result of a couple of passes of the darker tone. In a few minutes of work, I get a zenithal rendering of volumes that has nothing to envy to the sprayed version, and a very precise dark definition of every single little element. Honestly, better than anything that I can create with an airbrush. I move to contrast paints to set the main blocks of the scheme. I applied the washes before the basic colors, because changing the order of addends in this case really changes the sum. The bright colors keep all their power and vibrancy, because they don't get new desaturated pigments on top, filtering and toning down their information. They still merge with the previous values in transparency, but they remain the clean, saturated top layer. Like in the previous video, I really don't care about solid base tone or midtones, and even in this initial stage, I'm aiming to a modulated version of the basic scheme, using transparent paints made even more fluid and translucent through dilution. You can argue that using contrast paints, I don't need the sketch, because they are made to create a similar kind of modulation inside details. But even if I like these paints, they are not incredible as advertised. Even in the deepest recesses and the maximum concentration of paint possible, they still deliver only a slightly darker version of themselves. So if you want to use their full potential, you must push on their transparency and their ability to fuse information from different layers, in this case the value sketch. In addition, increasing and working with their fluidity and transparency, I can use different tones wet on wet to create a quick chromatic and extra value modulation that again has nothing to envy to the finest and most precise airbrushing. I use Aggaros Dunes to base the non-metallic bronze with a darker tone, and this is the only spot where I use it directly from the pot, simply because I find non-metal easier to work starting from a dark midtone, or the first shadows. If you compare the result with the airbrush version of the previous video, before lights and highlights with oils, you can clearly see that the visual output is almost identical. And you have to trust me on this, even the relative time needed to arrive to this point is almost the same. I have a saturated but blurred rendering of the scheme, unbalanced towards the first darker lights, midtones and every level of shadow, ready for the final stage of lights and highlights that will bring back all the balance of values, creating the definitive high contrast and all the missing light definition and details. I mentioned this idea in the previous video, but thanks to this more linear process and the use of acrylics and brush for the whole paint job, I think the concept is a bit easier to understand here. All my steps and layers are based on increasing levels of opacity. A flow starting with the first super translucent wash that culminates in the totally opaque extreme light of pure titanium white from the tube on the non-metallic metal. In this stage, I just came out from the transparency of diluted contrast, so even if I'm using aggressively opaque paints, what I'm really bringing to the model now is something like this, and that powerful opacity will become useful little by little in the next stages. It doesn't matter what kind of medium or process you are using. When you start painting lighter midtones, lights and highlights, every little movement of the brush becomes extremely important, because that's what really delivers the finish of your painting. You can hide almost every crime in the dark tones, and working in 3D, in the hidden surfaces of the shadows, even actively using the lack of brushstrokes and definition to create the illusion of darker values, swallowing the information. But lights reveal details, textures, and even the consistency of the materials. That's why this is the stage where I always invest most of my time, both in speed painting and the classic work. Here I'm painting a wrinkly old goblin that lives and fights in the desert, and I really don't need smoothness for this kind of picture. So almost everything is painted with the tip of the brush, little semi-transparent dots, and short sharp lines on the wrinkles. As promised, to make the new lighter applications more and more visible and relevant, I increase their opacity, reducing the level of dilution to something like this. It's not a classic layering, and for sure it's not a glazing by dotting because of this high opacity, but something in between, meant to quickly build a dense visible texture without becoming too obvious. All my colors are bright, saturated and warm, to maintain the coherency of the desert theme and its light. And as I explained in the previous video, I keep my mixing to a minimum, to keep every bit of the original saturation of my paints. Even my selection of tones for the blue skirt moves into a greenish turquoise. And even in the mid stages, I add a tiny bit of green or yellow inside everything to maintain the sensation of the warm environment and its oppressive heat. Thanks to the well-planned preparatory work, the only real challenge in this stage is the non-metallic metal. But that's always a challenge, probably in every situation. I start from the small areas of bracers and trophies, to find a good balance of contrast that later I can transfer and increase on the axis. Scale 75 Peanut Butter is one of my favorite colors for non-metallic bronze and gold. I like firmer consistencies for this kind of applications, but like the old snakebite leather, it has a great balance of yellow, orange and brown, with a medium saturation that's easily modulated adding white or black and browns to create strong lights and shadows. In the context of non-metallic elements, I want to keep the focus on the weapons, and more in general on beard, hair and skin. So instead of a super shiny yellow gold, I'm looking for a dull bronze kind of look, where I can use a lower contrast and more desaturated tones that will keep these small elements in their secondary place, without stealing the stage from the focal points. These are the only mixes where I added a good quantity of pure white to tone down their saturation. And even the highlights on the wrapping on the axis handles contain less pure white. The use of white in general is extremely contained here, because I don't want to introduce too many cold tones, or even cold sensations, that can easily spoil the effect of the fiery environment. For the same reason, I didn't use pure black, but only dark browns and their overlapped opacity. My brushstrokes and application style have been heavily focused on thick paint and textures in the whole paint job, even working on the small elements of the non-metallic gold. But on the large, flat, open areas of the blades, I have to switch to a subtle use of more transparent mixes, and to a sketch and refine flow that lets me quickly fix big blocks of light, but with soft edges easy to blend and fix later. I also really like the visual effect of the sketch, that creates the illusion of extra random reflections, and the natural movements of the light. With the general light in place, it's just a matter of working inside the shapes, making the light of every block lighter and lighter, and every shadow darker and darker, to create the final contrast. I close the work with the whitest white ever created, to paint the highest and sharpest edges, and to add the extreme sparks of reflected lights that will make you hear a bling in your head when you see the model. Again, white, and this white in particular, is used only here to bring contrast and the value jumps to the maximum. And since I don't have this kind of light anywhere else, the coherency of the light's progression is maintained, and its effect is multiplied by the contrast of quantity and quality. And here is the final result. A fun twist on old school techniques, updated to the modern era and to the most common tools of miniature painters. And a little provocation for all those modelers convinced that airbrushing unlocks secret powers and exclusive unfair techniques. The brush is the ultimate painting tool, still more or less the same as when it was invented. And everything inside the infinite realm of painting originates or can easily be reduced to the humble brush. You just need to be creative with it. If you have your goal clear in mind, and a good grasp of the properties of paints and tools you like to use. It doesn't matter what they are if you have fun using them. Well, you can always find a way to create what you want. Plus, if you are not a content creator making painting videos, nobody cares how you obtain the result. So have fun and don't stress too much.
If you like this video, give it a like and subscribe. Remember that you can ask me anything down below with a comment, and you can follow my projects during the week using one of my socials. And if you want to support my work, check my Patreon page and join the community, or maybe ask for a commission. See you next week, guys!